I'm going to grab the Altenew embossing paste. I haven't used this medium in a long time, and I thought new items from the August 2025 release were going to be perfect to showcase some techniques I wanted to try actually with the Altenew embossing paste. So stick around to the end to see the result of how I used the embossing paste with some new items from the August 2025 release. Before we get into today's project, make sure you subscribe to the Altenew channel for more card making and paper crafting tutorials. My Perfect Pairings with Jaycee series explores crafting techniques that effortlessly blend sure-to-love new releases and well-loved Altenew favorites. If you love these kinds of crafty tutorials, hit the bell icon so you'll be notified of my videos airing on the 2nd and 4th Sunday. And bring in the Build a Garden Rose Reverie set. So this set contains the stamp, stencil, and the die. And as you search through your stash to try to recreate this card, what I'm looking for is an outlined stamp with large open petal areas. And more importantly, a stencil that also fills in those large open petal areas. So you'll see on the layering guide found on the back and inside of the packaging that the layers for each petal fills in the images on the inside in a solid form. So there isn't really a detail layer. These stencils are made to create beautiful ombre or beautiful gradients on each of the petals so that you have a little bit more control on where to place color within the image. While the die is not necessary, fortunately this Build-A-Garden does come with it. I am going to use this in my card example, as I think it'll deliver stunning results today. The first thing I'm going to do is bring in a few panels of heavyweight white cardstock. So I'm going to use the embossing paste and also stamp my outline onto these panels. But first I'm going to bring in the Rose Reverie die. Just cut out this shape from 3 panels of white cardstock. I am cutting more than I probably need. In the end, I'm hoping that this will save me some time by cutting some extra pieces. So here are 2 positive pieces, and I've also kept the negative space and the positive piece for one of the images. If you're recreating this at home, I just recommend that you keep one of your negative spaces for now. And then in my Altenew stamp wheel, I'm going to center the negative space from around the die cut, and then inlay one of my positive pieces, making sure that both pieces make contact with my slim grit mat. Then I will position and center the stamp into my die cut shape and pick up the stamp with my flip plate. I'm going to keep things easy by stamping with the Altenew Obsidian pigment ink, and I'll end up with a gorgeous fine outline on my die cut. I'll leave the negative piece on my stamp wheel and gently pry off and remove my positive piece. I'll repeat this stamping process on my next 2 positive pieces, again with Obsidian pigment ink. Once I've stamped my final image, I can remove it from my stamp wheel. And just in case, I'll keep this in my 6.5 by 8.5 storage pocket, along with other items in this Build-A-Garden bundle. I'll put away my stamp wheel for now, and bring in my 9 by 12 sticky mat grid. These stamped outlines have had a little bit of time to dry, so I will put them on top of my sticky mat grid. And before I do anything with the petals on these images, I'm going to work on the leaves first. I'm bringing in the Rose Reverie Build-A-Garden stencil set. And again, these images and layers on the stencil set are more of an open type, so that you can create beautiful smooth gradients on each of the petals and the leaves as well. After referring to the layering guide found on the stencil packaging, the leaf layers are on stencil layers number 4 and number 5. Just be careful that we're going to omit the petal layers for now. And I'll just start with this bottom left cluster of roses and solely focus on the leaves like I mentioned. So these images right here, these 3 open images. And right now in the heat of summer, my rose leaves are kind of turning a bluish green. So I'm feeling kind of inspired by that today. And I'm applying a layer of Aqualicious first to the base of the leaves, leaving a little highlight at the end. Then I'll jump down to Galactic Stream to deepen the base of the leaves and create some interesting shadows, just like that. And I'll repeat this on a second image, just like so. After quickly cleaning off my stencil, I'm going to apply a different palette of greens to this last Rose Reverie cluster. For this one, I will use Misty Sage and Green Opal, starting with a base fill of Misty Sage on the entire leaf. Again, I'm still working on stencil number 4, and then jumping down to Green Opal to fill in the base of the leaf. And this entire time I have been using the mini ink blending tools to fill in these gradients. Now that I'm done with stencil layer number 4, I'll move on to stencil layer number 5, and this will fill in the remainder of the leaf images in this set. Again, I'm not going to color in these petal layers on the center of the rose yet, and everything else in the stencil is intended for the leaves. So I applied a base layer of Misty Sage, then I will move on to Green Opal. Then I'll quickly clean off my stencil and repeat the layering colors with Aqualicious and Galactic Stream on the other 2 roses in this set. And after I've finished filling in all of my leaf layers, I'll let this dry back a little bit, and then I'll return to start working on the petal images on all 3 of these die cut shapes. So now from the Rose Reverie Build a Garden stencil set, I'm going to start filling in the rose petals on these images. So I'll start with stencil layer number 1 and align the openings of the stencil to their respective layers on the rose image. And now this is where I'll start using the Altenew embossing paste. So in addition to the embossing paste, I also need my Altenew mixed media palette knife set, and I'll be using the smallest knife in here, which is the number 2 palette knife. And working one petal at a time, I'm not necessarily swiping this embossing paste to completely fill in the layer. What I'm doing is creating a taller edge towards the outside of the petal. Then with a brush, I'm using the number 18 watercolor brush with the flat bristles and a paper towel. Once I feel I have applied enough of the embossing paste to the edge of the petal, then I'll soften that gradient and push that embossing paste towards the center of the flower and wipe off the excess. So I'm applying a little bit of embossing paste and brushing that almost like we're painting with texture here. And you don't want to apply too heavy of layers because then this will take too long to dry. So you'll see it's almost not a complete fill. So I'm trying to get the texture of the bristles of my watercolor brush to fill in the petal layers of this rose. And once I've applied embossing paste to all the open layers, when I reveal the stencil, you'll see that we're going to get a slightly different texture from the embossing paste to give that really velvety feel to all of our petals. Let me see if I can tip this a little bit and you can see some of that brush stroke texture that we're getting on each of the petals. Since I have the number 1 stencil out, I'll fill in the remainder of the petal layers with the embossing paste. So again, I don't need a lot, and I'm applying a little bit just to the very edge or outside edge of each of the petal images. And once you get used to the motion of applying embossing paste to each of the petals, then you can do multiples at a time. So once I've applied the embossing paste, I can use my dry brush and move the embossing paste towards the center of the rose creating some brush stroke movements in the embossing paste. And I am trying to do this quickly before it dries. And since these layers are fairly thin, I anticipate that this won't take too long to dry on my project. Just like that. And again, I'll tilt this a little bit so that you can see the little bit of texture that we're getting from the embossing paste. Then I will repeat this on my last image down here. Once I'm happy with the result of this last image, I'll peel off the stencil and I'll quickly show you what this looks like. So there's a little bit of directional texture, especially on this petal. You can really tell the sort of waviness that happens in the petal. And I'll let this layer dry for, I don't know, anywhere between 30 minutes to an hour. But for now, I'm going to clean off stencil layer number 1 and my little using soap and water, and then I'll come back to fill in the second layer to all of these petals in the same fashion. I actually let these pieces dry overnight, and let me lift one of them up so that you can see the texture that we're going to get. I love that the embossing paste has retained the brushed texture on each of the petals. So hopefully there's this nice tactile texture that your card recipient can touch when they receive this card. But anyway, for now, I'm going to put this back on my Altenew Sticky Mat grid. And then working in numerical order, I have stencil layer number 2 now. And again, I'm going to align the opening of the stencil to each of the petal images, just like this. And for these layers that are more towards the center of the flower where it's not so obvious to put embossing paste, it might help to reference the guide that's in the product trifold to see where the white highlights are on the example provided in the image. And essentially wherever you see this white highlight found in the product trifold is where you will want to apply embossing paste, or it's merely a guideline of where I would put it. I'll use my number 2 palette knife again and apply a little bit of this paste again to where I think the white highlights will go on these rose petals. And then with that number 18 watercolor brush again, I'm going to add little brush strokes to the embossing paste and also help to move the embossing paste onto the petals. Aside from the texture that I'm adding with the watercolor brush, the dry watercolor brush, for the most part this is a fairly thin wash of this embossing paste. You'll see the sort of crepe paper feeling that we're getting on each of the petals as I remove these stencils and build their layers. And that is the effect that we're looking for with the embossing paste on all of these images. And again, I am doing this on 3 stamped images. You can certainly do this on just 1 image, but I'm compensating for any mistakes that I might make along the way. And in the end, if I have too many, then I'll be able to make more cards. So I don't see any harm in this. And since I'm waiting for all of these layers to dry anyway, I might as well be prepared to make more cards while I'm setting aside the time to dry. You know what I mean? So I'll keep applying a light layer of the embossing paste with my palette knife, move the embossing paste with my dry watercolor brush, create some directional strokes, and sort of paint the embossing paste onto my stencil. And then again, once I'm happy with the texture, I'll move on to the next image. Here's the second stencil on my third image, but for now, again, I will let this dry back for about 30 minutes to an hour. I'm not waiting for everything to be fully dry. I just want to be able to overlay the next layered stencil on top without compromising the fine texture that you're finding on all of the petals. So I'll be back in a bit. I feel like my previous layer from stencil number 2 can support the weight of the stencil as well as the pressure from the palette knives and such. So I'm going to go ahead and move on to stencil layer number 3 and gently overlay the image as per usual. I applied a layer of embossing paste. Then I will brush and create some interesting texture on the petals. And as we get into the higher number stencils, the details become more fine. So as you become more comfortable with applying the stenciled images to your outlines, this should work up pretty quickly and your time between applying layers should become shorter. And here's the result of the final image using stencil layer number 3. See, we're getting excellent texture now and a lot of height on the petals. Here's stencil layer number 4. Remember that stencil layers number 4 and 5 have the open leaf images, so just make sure that you're not embossing over those. And here's the effect on stencil layer number 4. And then we've got one more to go. And you'll notice I'm getting a lot of excellent texture and a lot of direction in the embossing paste. So this is definitely going to take center stage on your card front once it's all complete. I'm going to begin working one image at a time. The embossing paste on this is now completely dry, and I can tell by the back that there isn't any moisture anymore in the embossing paste. It's really important that the embossing paste on your cardstock is completely dry, because we will be working now with Altenew's fresh dye inks on top of the embossing paste to add some fabulous color and really complete the color palette on this rose. So I'm bringing back my stencils again in numerical order, so this is stencil layer number 1. And onto the open petal layers, I want to start ink blending. So I'm going to start with Citrus Burst and my mini ink blending tools again. And I will add this color through the stencil directly on top of the embossing paste, painting little gradients on each of the petals. I'm starting from the base of the petal, blending this ink out towards the tip. So that's Citrus Burst. I'll move down to Mandarin Burst and another mini ink blending tool, and I'm applying a shallower gradient of this on the petal and letting the bristles capture the high points of the embossing paste. Then lastly, I'll grab red jasper and apply an even shallower gradient of this ink. So let's reveal that. Then I'll keep working my way down in numerical order of the stencils, filling in these petal layers in that same gradient. So Citrus Burst, then Mandarin Burst, then red jasper. And if I make any errors in my coloring as I'm doing this, fortunately I have two other backups. I only used Citrus Burst and Mandarin Burst on this final layer, stencil layer number 5. I omitted the leaf layers on this. So now, as I lift this up and show you the texture on here, you'll see that the ink captured the high points of the embossing paste, giving some realistic and interesting tactile texture to this rose now. So it's almost like you can experience touching a real-life rose with their nice velvety petals and that marshmallow type bounciness when you squeeze a bud that's about to open. That's sort of what this reminds me of. So I'm happy with the results of this. I have 2 more embossed images that I can work with, so I'm going to experiment a little bit with the color palettes on those, and then I'll show you the end results of that. Again, here's that first iteration and color palette that I used to create this yellow-orange blend on each of the petals. Then I wanted a blush rose color palette. I used rose quartz and purple wine to get this dreamy mauve blend. And then on this last version, I only used pink sand to create a dreamy white gradient on this version here. I feel like adding one last detail to the leaves of this rose. So I'm going to take out the Altenew fine liner pen set and use the 01 weight pen to add additional vein details to the leaves of my rose cluster. I feel like these fine lines are going to help complement the fine lines from the brushed texture on the embossing. And I feel like this will help give the leaves a little bit more direction and flow as well. I'm creating little curved strokes to add in to each of the leaves, just like that. So I'm really excited to see how this turns out in the end. I'm going to play with a different orientation of this cluster. So I'm going to repeat adding the fine line details to my remaining 2 Rose Reverie clusters. I'll reveal all of my cards to you in just a second. And here's the end result of the orange and teal-leaved rose cluster. I used a background cardstock of dark chocolate and also outlined the outside of the Rose Reverie cluster using the same Altenew artist marker. Here's the end result of the rose-petaled colored Rose Reverie cluster. I used Morning Frost cardstock and also its Altenew artist marker equivalent to finish off this simple sympathy card. And then finally, I did not make any modifications to the Rose Reverie cluster on this one. I used the Sand Dunes cardstock and its coordinating Altenew artist marker to let these white blooms really shine through on this cardstock panel. On all of these, I used the essential black and white enamel dots to add little flowy embellishments throughout the bouquet. And that finishes my take on using embossing paste with a watercolor brush to give interesting texture to my Build-A-Garden Rose Reverie image. As always, I have all of the materials I used on these cards in the description box. And if you decide to recreate this card, please tag me at jaycee.gaspar and at Altenew LLC. I'd love to take a look at your projects. My series encourages you to shop your existing Altenew stash and rekindle their love with newer releases. Perfect Pairings with Jaycee airs on the Altenew channel every second and fourth Sunday of the month. Please make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for tuning in to this Perfect Pairing episode with me, and I'll see you in the next one.
Wait, we have more where that came from. If you're after fabulous card making tutorials, you are definitely in the right spot. Our amazing design team create and upload fabulous video tutorials right to this YouTube channel. If you don't want to miss another amazing crafting tutorial, don't forget to subscribe and click that fun red button that you can see. Let's become paper crafting experts together.